A wealthy mother had planned the perfect party, with expensive wine, flowers imported from France, and a guest list selected with utmost care. But when her son, standing in the silent crowd, quietly called the black nanny Mom, the entire room went dead quiet, and no one, not even she herself, was prepared for what happened next. Madison Whitmore was nearly 40, but looked younger, thanks to the meticulous attention she paid to every strand of hair. Madison never left home without checking her makeup in 3 different mirrors. She was considered a success by all conventional standards. A Yale graduate, owner of a chain of high-end furniture boutiques, featured in fashion magazines, and the driving force behind multiple charitable foundations. Yet, in none of those interviews had she ever once mentioned her son. Elliot Whitmore, 4 years old, had tousled, sandy blonde hair and eyes the color of an autumn lake. He should have been the center of this home, like any child born to an elite family, raised to be a young gentleman. But instead he lived in an echoing, empty space in which his mother appeared precisely at 8 o'clock every morning, as though on cue, and again each evening just before bedtime, planting a perfunctory kiss on his forehead, as if playing the role of the perfect mother in some grand social performance. And in the vast darkness of that overly large house, there was one person quietly filling in those empty spaces. Grace Carter, the black caregiver who lived in the small room beside the laundry, was the warm embrace when Elliot cried, the gentle hand that soothed his nightmares each night, the soft lullaby drifting through the cavernous room in which the boy had never felt truly comfortable. She wasn't considered a member of the household. She was the very breath of life, the only source of affection in a place where everything else felt cold and calculated. Grace was in her early 30s, slender, with deep brown skin and eyes that seemed to hold an untold story. In a house where every object had its assigned place, she was the one person who didn't belong to any particular corner. Yet because of that, she existed everywhere. In the kitchen, the nursery, the backyard, anywhere, the rare laughter of Elliot emerged from his dreams. She knew he was afraid of thunder, disliked fizzy apple juice, and only slept soundly when his hair was stroked exactly 3 times before bedtime. Elliot never called her Nanny. He wasn't taught that. To him, she was simply Grace, and in those moments no one else saw, when their cheeks pressed together, when his tiny arms wrapped around her neck, when his whispered voice filled the darkness. He called her Mommy. No one knew, and no one needed to. Madison never asked about the hours Grace spent reading fairy tales, wiping away tears, or cutting sandwiches into perfect triangles. To Madison, those tasks were just part of the job, and a hired hand, no matter how diligent, gentle, or devoted, was merely a service to be managed. One afternoon at a tea party with her friends, Madison once said, "Grace does a fine job, but I don't like her wearing bright colors. It draws too much attention. Besides, it clashes with the decor." Grace heard those words. She didn't react. She simply replaced her wardrobe entirely with neutral tones, gray, navy, beige, and continued caring for a child who wasn't hers in a home that did not welcome her, because of a love that had once been lost and could not be stopped. No one in that mansion knew that Grace had once had a son of her own. His name was Micah, and he died at the age of 4, exactly Elliot's age now. Grace never told a soul. But each time Elliot curled against her chest in laughter, each time his small hand gripped hers during a nightmare, her heart skipped a beat, caught between living and surviving, between pain and healing. In a world where everything is measured and controlled, there are some things that cannot be bound, unconditional love. And in the Holleridge estate, where every room felt as cold as glass, only Grace, the woman whose name did not appear in any high-end payroll or in any of the owner's introductions, quietly kept the only flame that made the house feel even a little bit alive. Under the dim lights of the service corridor in the basement, where the washing machines growl like the steady breathing of some enormous beast, lies the small room, not even 8 square meters, that Grace calls home. The walls, painted years ago, have since faded. There's a single bed, a low wooden dresser with drawers that often stick, and a folding table mounted on the wall. Everything she owns in this space, completely cut off from the opulence directly above. Each evening, once Elliot is fast asleep in his pastel-colored nursery, with its automated light-filtering curtains and a top-of-the-line white noise machine, Grace slips back down here. There's no laughter, no fresh flowers, no crystal glasses clinking over fine wine. Yet, in this tiny room, another part of her still lives. And that part goes by the name Micah. In the top drawer of that beaten-up dresser, lined neatly with linen, sits a photograph so worn around the edges that the border is barely visible. It shows a black boy of about 4, grinning from ear to ear, one of his front teeth crooked like a little spark of mischief. He has one sock slipping down to his ankle, and he clutches a plastic toy car whose wheel is long gone. In that picture, Micah was still alive. He was still Grace's hope. He was proof that the world had not yet grown entirely cruel. Grace didn't often cry, but every night she'd whisper to that photograph, "Sleep tight, my son." Then she'd sit very still for a long time, her hand tracing the frame's edge, as though afraid to leave too soon lest the memory slip away. In that silence, 2 versions of time overlapped, Micah and Elliot, the part lost and the part still held, the motherhood that had been shattered and the love she could offer temporarily. 10 years ago, Grace lived on the south side, where ambulances wouldn't arrive unless you called 3 times, and where black patients always ranked last in line. Micah ran a high fever for 2 days straight. When Grace carried him into the emergency room, he was already unconscious. But the white nurse at the registration desk, barely looking at her, handed Grace a form and said, "Wait your turn. You're not the only one here." She waited for 3 hours. By the time a doctor arrived, sepsis had spread through Micah's bloodstream. He could only whisper one phrase, "Mommy, I hurt." And that was the last time he ever called her that. Grace never sued anyone. She didn't have a lawyer, didn't have reliable health insurance, didn't have a voice. All she had was a small, hastily made gravestone and a permanent crack in her heart. A crack that Madison Whitmore, with her Louboutin heels and perfectly measured words, would never understand. Upstairs, Madison remained Madison, perfect, purposeful, and determined never to let emotions infiltrate any aspect of her life. To her, everyone was just a link in her carefully curated image chain. Elliot was the adorable child, so long as he stayed quiet. Grace was the efficient employee, so long as she didn't draw attention. And Madison herself was the centerpiece, responsible for keeping everything from unraveling. No one was allowed to spoil the bigger picture she had painstakingly assembled. Grace understood that. She never crossed any boundaries, always wore the uniform Madison preferred, always used the service staircase, never ate in the main kitchen, never spoke unless spoken to, never hugged Elliot in front of guests, even though the boy would often burrow into her as if no one else existed in the world. But within that silence, Grace lived 2 lives, a quietly dutiful caretaker and a mother whose love never faltered. Elliot didn't know about Micah, but unconsciously, the boy was receiving the remainder of Grace's love that had been taken from her, buried under the cold earth of a Southside cemetery. Every time Elliot ran a fever, Grace trembled with fear. Every time Elliot cried himself through the night, she stayed by his side until sunrise, unwilling to sleep. Not out of obligation, but because the trauma of losing Micah still haunted her. And in those moments one thought always surfaced. I couldn't save Micah, but I can keep Elliot safe, even if only for a little while. Sometimes, during rare moments when Elliot was occupied with his biological mother, posing for pictures at some event, Grace would stand back and watch. She would see Elliot's eyes dart around, searching for her, even while he was forced to stand still next to Madison's formal gown. She saw his small hand clench at his side, unsure where to rest. Deep inside, she knew. Truth didn't lie in a birth certificate, nor in one's bloodline. Truth lay in the invisible bond between two hearts, one already broken, the other learning to love. Grace never wanted to replace Madison. She never harbored that ambition, but she understood that some things need no title to hold eternal value. Elliot didn't call her mom, at least not yet, but in his eyes, in his embrace, in the way he clutched her tightly, he spoke that truth without uttering a word. And Grace, down here in the basement's gloom, bearing scars from her past, continued to lull to sleep a child who was no longer alive, and hold close a child who was not officially hers. To her, those two boys were never separate. They were two halves of the same love she was never allowed to give in full. And while Grace lived her second life in silence, her wounds and abiding love still throbbing, on the top floor of the Holleridge estate, Madison Whitmore carried on with her days as a mother, by all the high society definitions, perfect, controlled, and always on time. Madison never raised her voice. Her tone was always measured, just loud enough to be heard, just cool enough to feel icy, and never crossing into actual emotion, because, as she once told her personal assistant, anger creates wrinkles, and wrinkles strip a woman of her power. To Madison, every detail was calculated, from the flick of a fingertip to the look in her eye when she entered the drawing room. Elliot, her biological son, was merely one element in the overall image Madison had designed. A child dressed appropriately, arriving at precisely the right moment, greeting everyone exactly as instructed, and staying properly silent. When guests were present, she remembered him, lifting a glass of juice to his lips as if performing a ritual, placing her hand on his shoulder for carefully staged photographs that captured a perfect mother-son moment. But once the guests left, Elliot disappeared from Madison's attention as though he were nothing more than a piece of stage scenery. Once, for Elliot's 4th birthday, Grace baked a small cake for him, and they blew out the candles together in the nursery. The boy laughed as he was allowed to smear frosting across Grace's face with his tiny hands. An hour later, Madison appeared, her hair softly curled, wearing a flawless pastel Dior dress, scowling at the messy cake, and delivering a line like a blade slicing through air. "That looks like something from a diner." She then turned to Elliot and instructed him, as if training a parrot, "Next time, let the pastry chef handle the cake. You wouldn't want your birthday photos ruined by hand-smeared frosting, right?" Elliot stood there, eyes downcast, his lip trembling. But as soon as Madison's back was turned, he bolted to Grace's side and hugged her legs tightly, as though only then could he truly be a child. Madison didn't see those moments, and perhaps she never wanted to. The difference between these two women, one standing at the pinnacle of wealth, the other huddled by the basement door, was not merely about their social standing. It lay in how they touched a child's heart. To Madison, motherhood was merely an accessory to her image. She did not hate Elliot, but her love for him was always conditional. When he behaved properly, when he appeared well in the public eye, when he made no trouble. When he skinned his knee in the backyard, Madison simply summoned a staff member to attend to him. She never rushed over, never asked if he was in pain, never wiped away his tears. But Grace did all those things, without being asked, without pay. That was why Elliot always remembered running to Grace's arms, not his mother's. He always knew whose hand to seek in the nightmare hours of the night. He would whisper in Grace's ear, "You're my secret mommy, okay?" That simple question made Grace's heart crack and tremble in waves. She never said yes, and she never said no. She simply stroked Elliot's hair and held him tight, as if that was the last bit of healing she could give herself. Madison was no fool. She sensed that bond growing stronger. She had caught Elliot's gaze lingering on Grace through door frames, those big, bright eyes full of anticipation and trust. She had seen the tight hugs, and the moments when Elliot tugged Grace's hand to keep her in the room longer. And inside her, an unease began to burn. Not because she feared losing her child, but because she felt her control slipping bit by bit. At tea parties with other elite wives, Madison spoke of Elliot in carefully edited anecdotes. He's studying French. He loves the cello. As you know, I've invested heavily in his emotional development from a very early age. The other women would nod, sip champagne, and glance over at Grace pouring tea in the corner, without a single word of thanks. Madison never mentioned Grace in those conversations. Why would she? To her, Grace was just another part of the system, like the washing machines, the air purifier, or the estate's lighting system, good enough to keep, disruptive enough to replace. But Madison was wrong about one thing. Love, that seemingly invisible, useless thing in her world, refused to stay confined to neat social templates. It seeped through every lingering glance, every hug, every lullaby sung in the dead of night that Madison never heard. And someday, Madison didn't know when, Elliot would name that love in the simplest, most unguarded way, and her small, controlled world would shatter. Grace did not wait for that day. She never sought the title of mother. But she lived each day as if she already had that recognition, because for her, motherhood required no title. It only required a heart. Meanwhile, Madison, who had everything, did not know that the one thing she could never buy was exactly what the woman in the basement possessed: a child's unconditional trust and love. And then that day arrived, the day Madison Whitmore had been scheduling for 3 months, planning for 12 weeks, and tweaking every detail for 10 straight days. The Whitmore family's annual garden party was not merely a social gathering. It was an image campaign. An opportunity for Madison to reaffirm her status in high society. Beautiful, powerful, with not a wrinkle to be found in her demeanor or her life. That morning, the air in the Holleridge estate was thick with tense silence. The cleaning staff moved as if walking on shards of glass. No sound, no complaints. The groundskeepers were called back for the second time in one day to trim the lawn more evenly, at Madison's insistence, simply because a single maple leaf had fallen out of place on the stoned pathway. Inside the house, the scent of Le Labo room spray mingled with imported roses from Grasse, France. But what truly permeated every room was the odor of preparation that tolerated no mistakes. On the long dining table, draped in pristine white linen, each silver fork was aligned using a tiny metal ruler. Rows of hors d'oeuvres, each canapé meticulously garnished with tweezers, sat under the cool white glow of adjustable spotlights. Upstairs, Elliot was being forced into a miniature Ralph Lauren suit, complete with a navy bow tie, too tight, too stiff, and altogether foreign to a child who was used only to the soft t-shirts and cotton shorts Grace folded neatly in his dresser. Madison was not in the room. She was busy finalizing the menu and confirming the guest list. Among them, at least 3 members of the Educational Foundation's board she had just been invited to join. The boy snuffled. His hand kept scratching at his collar. His eyes burned with unshed tears, but he dared not cry out loud. Elliot hated the bow tie. It made him feel as if he were tied up. But what bothered him most was Grace still hadn't arrived. A moment later, Grace came in, wearing the pale ash-gray uniform dress Madison had demanded. High-necked, long-sleeved, so modest it seemed to conceal even the wearer's heart. She hurried to the boy, knelt to his level, and said nothing. With a single practiced motion, she gently removed the bow tie, rubbed the back of his neck, then retied it a bit looser and slightly off-center, just enough to look neat in photos while still allowing him to breathe. "Feeling better, baby," she whispered, her cool fingers brushing his cheek. Elliot nodded quickly and wrapped his arms around her neck. It was only a fleeting moment, but in that instant he could breathe again. He remembered why he'd felt safe in a house that was far too big and altogether too cold. Grace was about to stand when a cutting voice interrupted, quiet but sharp enough to freeze the air. "Grace, please keep the boy intact. I don't need any extra doting." Madison had just entered, her gaze flicking to the loosened bow tie. She wore a form-fitting ivory dress, her hair styled in perfect soft waves, and ivory pumps clicking on the floor in a rhythm like a conductor's baton. "We're about to receive guests. Elliot has to maintain his image." She said, maintain not as a suggestion, but as an order meant for an object. Grace didn't answer. She nodded and stepped back, but her hand brushed Elliot's shoulder one last time before pulling away, an unspoken reassurance. Elliot merely lowered his head, pressing his lips together. He had learned that whenever his biological mother was present, anything he cherished had to be kept secret. Madison approached and bent down to adjust the bow tie, tightening it another half-centimeter. Elliot shivered but dared not move. He looked at Grace, his eyes asking, "Can I take this off later?" She did not respond. She only tilted her head and offered him a sad smile. That afternoon the party began. The entrance was laid with a cream-colored carpet. A trio of jazz musicians played near the fountain. Their notes were as smooth as red wine. Guests, figures from the worlds of finance, medicine, the arts, stepped out of Mercedeses, Range Rovers, and limited-edition Teslas. Silk gowns, skinny ties, Italian leather shoes, and expensive cologne formed a silent chorus of wealth. Madison glided across the wooden garden floor as if it were a runway. She smiled at precisely the right intervals and shook hands with exactly the correct pressure. Elliot followed behind, small and timid, holding a glass of orange juice with both hands. The bow tie around his neck remained stiffly in place. Grace stood at the edge, next to the serving table, clutching a silver tray and watching Elliot like a gentle shadow. A guest, Mrs. Martha Jensen, wife of a U.S. senator, bent down to praise Elliot. "You're such a well-mannered young man, like a little prince." Madison smiled and tilted her head gracefully. "We place a great emphasis on emotional education. Elliot has been learning proper behavior from an early age. I won't let anyone else teach him." Grace heard those words from a distance. She showed no reaction, only quietly squeezed the tray's handle until her knuckles turned white. Elliot, however, stopped in his tracks. He stood still in the afternoon sunlight. His eyes did not look at his mother. They went searching for Grace. And there, in that moment when no one was paying attention, their gazes met, quiet, steadfast, like an underground melody flowing beneath the party's manufactured glitz. A melody not included in Madison's carefully orchestrated social score. The late afternoon sun draped the Whitmore garden in a soft glow, filtering through the twinkling string lights hung around the pergola like falling stars. The trees had been pruned to perfection. The tablecloths were snow-white, and the silver trays gleamed under the lights as if this were a high-society wedding rather than a family party. Everything looked as though it had been lifted straight from the pages of Garden and Grace magazine. Guests raised their champagne flutes. Polite laughter and the gentle jazz notes blended together into the flawless sound Madison Whitmore had worked so tirelessly to achieve. Each tone calibrated down to the smallest emotional nuance, each moment of quiet intentionally placed to evoke a sense of power without having to shout. Madison stood at the center of the garden, holding a glass of sparkling rosé, clad in a blush Carolina Herrera gown that hugged her slender figure. Her eyes swept over the assembled guests, powerful couples, CEOs, investors, and even a few directors from the education fund she was trying to secure sponsorship from. Her lips curved into a perfect, famously rehearsed smile, one she had practiced in front of a mirror for 3 nights straight. This was her moment. Her speech had been finalized a week ago, every sentence honed like a Broadway script. She lifted her glass and cleared her throat. Then, at that precise instant, a child's voice rang out, high, clear, and utterly oblivious to the right moment Madison had drilled into her assistant's head. "Mommy, Mommy Grace!" The exclamation tore through the air like a clap of thunder in a cathedral. Heads snapped around, whispers died to hushed confusion, and a few people stifled giggles, thinking it an endearing slip-up. But before anyone could grasp the full meaning of what was surfacing beyond polite society, young Elliot, dressed in his little suit, bow tie askew, and chocolate smeared across his face, charged through the crowd, weaving between silk skirts and Italian leather loafers. Grace had barely registered the movement when the boy lunged forward and wrapped himself around her. An earnest, messy embrace, as real as all the things this household tried so hard to keep hidden. She nearly lost her balance, almost dropping her tray of hors d'oeuvres. But she steadied herself, just as she had managed to do for the past 4 years. "I kept the cookie for you, Mommy," Elliot whispered excitedly, offering her half of a bitten cookie. From the center of the garden, Madison froze like a wax figure. The champagne in her glass tilted slightly, the bubbles rippling as if mirroring the things she could no longer control. Her eyes fell away from that practiced smile. Her face went chalk white. Her fingers clenched so tightly that her knuckles stood out like white ivory. A woman standing nearby overheard and murmured loud enough for others to catch. "Did that boy just call the housekeeper Mommy?" A young man beside her half smiled, half gasped, "My God! Whitmore is redefining motherhood now." No one listened to Madison's speech. No one looked at Madison. Every gaze was riveted on a scene that had not been part of any plan. The cherished air of a prestigious family, hugging a uniformed woman whose hair was pulled back, tray still in hand. Grace knelt to bring herself level with Elliot, softly dabbing the chocolate from his mouth with the sleeve of her uniform, ignoring the fact that the stain would never wash out completely. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "Mommy's working right now." "But I miss you," Elliot replied, burrowing into her arms like a tiny kitten. At that moment, Madison moved swiftly toward them. She came to a stop barely 2 paces away from Grace. No yelling, no snatching, just a voice as cold as a winter's gust in the basement. "Elliot, stand up, now." The boy lifted his head, but did not budge. Madison turned on Grace, her gaze molten steel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Grace remained silent, her hand still resting protectively behind Elliot's back, shielding him from a world shaking at the revelation of a single word. "Mommy." A small voice rose from the guest section. "That boy seems to know exactly who really takes care of him." The entire garden held its breath. The jazz had fallen silent moments ago. The server froze, clutching a tray of cocktails. A few people dug into their pockets to record the scene on their phones. Madison saw them, acutely aware that this image was spreading in real time. No press needed, no sensationalist headline. Just one hashtag, #Mommy Grace. In her barely contained fury, Madison forced a brittle, fractured smile. "The boy, he must be mistaken. Grace here has been a long-time housekeeper. We adore her, but, well, boys have big imaginations." She addressed the crowd, not her own child, not Grace, but Elliot was not confused. He turned and stood tall amid a circle of witnessing eyes, his hand still clutching Grace's. Then he spoke, unafraid, unwavering, in a voice steadier than most children his age. "She's my mom, not because she gave birth to me, but because she really loves me." And in that very instant, The truth could no longer be concealed. Madison had not just lost her speech. She'd lost the child she thought she controlled. Madison Whitmore still tried to keep smiling, but that smile no longer had its usual perfect curve. It wavered, twisted, trembling like makeup cracking under the weight of mounting panic. "That boy's just a little confused," she said, voice soft but hurried, as though trying to calm the rising tide around her. "You all know how it is. Grace has always been the one caring for him. Kids can mix things up, especially at such a young age." She spoke gently, but her eyes betrayed total loss of control, an emotion Madison regarded as her worst personal defeat. Behind the crystal flute and the string lights, the crowd was no longer itself. The guests, who had been chatting politely, full of admiration, now looked half skeptical, half thrilled, as though witnessing a noble scandal unfolding right before them. Grace remained still, the serving tray set aside at some point, her ash-gray uniform stained with chocolate on one side, her hands gently resting on Elliot's shoulders. No words, no attempt at rebuttal. Yet that very silence became a weapon, unsettling Madison more than any direct confrontation ever could. Elliot still clung to Grace's hand without hesitation. A woman near the pergola tilted her head toward her friend and whispered, "That boy's looking at her like she's really his mother." Her friend replied, voice low but clear, "Then what does Mrs. Whitmore think she is? His godmother?" Immediately, a click sounded. One of the guests, a fashion and society blogger, had snapped a photo of Elliot in Grace's arms and typed a pointed caption directly on her phone. "Child of the elite calls nanny mommy in front of high society crowd. Heartbreaking or humiliating?" Madison caught a glimpse of that image on the woman's screen as she was typing. She stepped forward, jaw tight, forcing out, "Maybe, don't post that." The boy but it was too late. Within minutes, half a dozen phones were raised. Someone from the PR team had tried pleading with guests not to film, but the eyes in the garden had already captured everything. A wealthy child, calling the black caregiver Mommy amid champagne and jazz. That was what the media would call untapped gold. No one paid attention to the dessert station anymore. No one touted the creme brulee made with organic eggs from their Vermont farm. Madison's flawless image had cracked, and that fissure was widening by the second. For nearly a decade of hosting parties like this, Madison Whitmore had succeeded in projecting an impeccable image, an elite family, a mother who was simple yet refined, raising her son in a humane way through art programs and organic nutrition. She'd even been interviewed by The Sphere magazine about her parenting philosophy, and received a Mother of the Year award from an affluent charitable foundation. But it had all been about the image. An image that today, because of a 4-year-old's innocent call, was crumbling before the very social circle it had taken years to join. Madison inhaled deeply, then advanced toward Grace. Finally, for the first time since the party began. "You," she ground out, voice low despite herself. "Step away from that boy. Right now." Grace looked up, silent. Elliot still clung to her skirt. "This is my party. This is my family. You are not allowed to stand there as if—" Madison stopped herself, realizing she shouldn't finish that sentence in front of everyone. Yet Grace's calm, steady gaze made her feel utterly exposed. Madison turned away. She noticed a woman live-streaming the event on Instagram. She saw the comments popping up rapidly. "OMG, that kid really said, 'Mommy Grace'? This is giving the Help 2.0 vibes. Hire the nanny, fire the mom." She felt her skin flush as if stripped bare. For the first time, Madison realized there are things money, power, and PR spin cannot control, things like a child's heart. That night, as the party wound down under dimmed lights and luxury cars began pulling away from the estate, Madison sat alone in her study. On her laptop, Elliot's photo in Grace's embrace had appeared on 2 major blogs. On Twitter, the hashtag number #MommyGrace was trending regionally. She read the comments, her pulse pounding in her ears. Maybe that nanny was more of a mom than Madison ever was. I hope Grace gets her own story. She deserves more than background credits. Proof that children know who truly loves them. She closed the screen, but the echo of "mommy" lingered, haunting her mind like a curse. No contract, press release, or PR campaign could erase. It was no longer just a garden party story. It was the first blemish on Madison Whitmore's carefully curated career of reputation. And what hurt most of all was that it didn't come from a scandal of deceit or betrayal, but from a naked truth, unavoidable and undeniable, genuine love. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the second-floor glass curtains and spilled onto the wooden floor like a gentle reminder of a new day, the atmosphere in the Whitmore estate's tea room felt heavy, almost as if a storm had raged through during the night, and no one had noticed. Madison sat there, surrounded by cream-colored furnishings and the aroma of fine Darjeeling tea. She stirred her cup slowly, yet her eyes revealed waves of suppressed anger. Anger not unleashed like an ordinary person's, but held back, fermenting, and as cold as metal steeped in ice. She didn't take a single sip. The spoon's movement in the cup seemed merely a ritual to force her mind back into order, an attempt to reclaim control after a long night in which social media, her own son, and a woman she'd always regarded as beneath her, had all conspired to undermine her. When the mahogany door swung open, Charles Whitmore, her husband, a real estate investment magnate who always appeared like a timely shadow, stepped in, removing his glasses as he spoke. Press started messaging me at 5 a.m. Do you think we should stay silent or issue a statement? Madison didn't answer right away. She set down her spoon, and the click against the cup's rim sounded like the bell of a bleak decision. Looking up, she met her husband's eyes, her voice steady and unwavering. Grace is destroying the family's image. Elliot is too attached to her. Everyone sees that. The media is laughing at us. Charles shrugged, neither surprised nor judgmental, simply exhibiting the indifference typical of someone accustomed to handling crises by cutting out the disruption. If that's the case, he replied tersely, let her go. 7 words. Yet those 7 words carried a kind of callous power, a power assumed by class, money, and social hierarchy. It was as cold and detached as a pre-printed termination letter from a law firm. Madison said nothing more. She didn't need to. Charles had given her the permission excuse. Now, all that remained was action. Less than an hour later, Madison summoned Grace to the home office, a room rarely open to anyone beyond financial advisors or personal stylists. When Grace entered, the light from the large windows slanted across her composed face, setting up a perfect contrast with the icy expression of the woman seated behind the desk. You know why I called you here, Madison began, flipping a file on the desk that she didn't actually need, an obvious attempt to mask the fact that her next words had been memorized since dawn. Grace said nothing. She simply stood there, hands clasped in front of her, her eyes calm. We appreciate your dedication to Elliot, Madison continued, her tone even as if reading from a script. But the level of attachment you've shown recently is no longer appropriate for someone in your position as a hired caregiver. Grace blinked once, softly but without any sign of resistance or anger. She remained as though she had anticipated every word, as if these remarks were merely the inevitable conclusion of a play in which she was never meant to be the lead. Therefore, Madison concluded, your contract will end at the end of the month. We'll provide a positive letter of recommendation if you need one, but I trust you understand why this is necessary. No, thank you. No handshake. Not even a steady look. Madison treated it like she was simply replacing a throw pillow that didn't match the decor, rather than letting go of someone who had cared for their only child for 4 years. Grace nodded silently. Her voice, gentle as ever, came low and sure. "I understand." She turned to leave, but a small, urgent cry rang out from behind the door left ajar. "No, no, Mommy Grace isn't going anywhere." Both women froze. Elliot, no one knew how long he had been standing there, rushed into the office, his face flushed with panic. His eyes, brimming with tears, were fixed on his birth mother as though Madison had just done the unforgivable. "I heard everything," Elliot shouted, clinging to Grace's hand as if trying to pull the entire world closer to him. "I'm not letting Mommy Grace go anywhere. She's my mom." Madison reeled back. For a moment, her eyes flickered with disbelief, as if she could not believe the child she carried had actually chosen someone else. But then, as she always did, she compressed her feelings into an icy command. "Elliot, stop it right now. You're making a joke of yourself." "No," he screamed. "She's the one I love. You don't love me like she does." The kitchen door crashed open. The chef and a housekeeper, someone who had quietly served every event and cleaned up the lavish aftermath that no one remembered, now stood watching in silence. They said nothing, but their eyes confirmed it all. They had seen, they had understood, and they would no longer remain silent. Grace bent down and placed a hand on Elliot's cheek, gently wiping his tears with the rough palm that had cared for children not her own for so many years. "Sweetheart," she whispered softly, "you will be okay. You have a good heart. Don't lose it." "But I want you to stay," Elliot choked out. "I don't want you to leave." Grace held him tightly one last time, then straightened and looked at Madison, her first gaze at the woman since entering the room. "Thank you for letting me stay with him as long as you did. But now I know it's time for me to go. Not because I did anything wrong, but because in this house, love has no place to remain." She turned and walked away, Elliot's sobs echoing behind her, and Madison stood motionless, utterly speechless, unable to undo anything. Only the emptiness remained, a decision that was right in theory, yet profoundly wrong in the realm of human truth. Grace had just turned to leave the office, her farewell words still hanging like an untied thread, when the living room door flew open. There, on the cool Carrara marble floor, Elliot came hurtling like a gust of wind, tears streaming down his face, screaming, "No, no, I don't want Mommy Grace to go. Please don't leave, Mom." His cry echoed through the hushed room like the roar of a cathedral, where every teacup had once been measured to precisely 63 degrees Celsius, every napkin folded into origami as a ritual of perfection. But now, that perfection was being rejected by a little heart breaking before anyone was prepared. Elliot dove forward, wrapping his arms around Grace's legs, burying his face in her uniform skirt. Tears mixed with snot and yesterday's chocolate smears, all smudged onto the dress that was always laundered with lavender-scented soap. Grace froze. Her hands trembled, not out of surprise, but because old pain had just burst open. Madison appeared from the office a moment later. She stared at the scene as if it were unreal, like some ridiculous performance tarnishing the fractured image she had spent years building. She strode forward, trying to keep calm, but every movement betrayed her loss of control. "Elliot, get up right now," she ordered, her voice firm but low. "You're not allowed to act like this. You're embarrassing your mother." "I don't need you anymore," Elliot screamed, his sobs racking him. "I need Mommy Grace. She's my real mom." Those words cut through Madison's perfect facade like acid on paint. Her face went pale, her practiced smile frozen and cracked. She raised a hand to pull her son away from Grace, but Elliot clung tighter, his tiny nails snagging on her skirt. His feet slipped on the polished floor tiles, but he would not let go. "That boy needs to be calmed down," Madison said, though her voice trembled with disarray. She glanced around, looking for someone's support, for an ally to help her reclaim her authority. But what did she see? Silence. In the kitchen doorway, Chef Ramon stood with flour still clinging to his hands from a batch of dough left half-finished. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something deeper than words. I saw everything. We all saw. Beside him, Linda, the middle-aged housekeeper who had worked in this mansion for over 10 years, laid her cleaning cloth on the counter and stopped what she was doing. She did not step forward. She did not pry the boy away. She did not help Madison. She simply stood there, a silent witness to a truth that had been hidden for far too long, now exploding into the open. No one moved, because everyone, though they had never said it, had known all along. Grace was this child's true mother. Not by birth certificate, not by blood, but by every feverish hug, every comforted nightmare, every sandwich cut into perfect triangles, every hurried morning spent tying shoelaces in silence. Grace bent down, cupping Elliot's chin in her roughened hand, the same hand that had once been powerless to save Micah. And now, those same fingers felt a fear of being abandoned by a child who did not deserve such pain. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "listen to me." "Don't say that." Elliot shook his head, tears splattering like summer rain. "You are not a hired mom. You are my real mom. Don't let them take you away." Grace's legs gave out beneath her, but she forced herself not to collapse. For Elliot, for Micah, for all the children who were denied the right to choose who truly loved them. She knelt down, pulling Elliot into her arms, hugging him as if it were the last time she would hold her own son. Her forehead pressed against his hair. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, yet her voice remained steady. "I'm not leaving because you did something wrong. I'm leaving because there is no longer any place here for the truth. Do you understand?" Elliot did not understand. How could a 4-year-old grasp the layers of adult deception? But he felt one thing clearly. The person he trusted most was slipping away, and he could do nothing to stop it. At last, Grace slowly pried Elliot's fingers from her skirt, one tiny finger at a time. He resisted. He cried. Yet she continued, borne by all the agony of a mother who had lost a child and now had to let go once more. Madison watched this scene with a strange feeling, neither regret nor satisfaction but emptiness. A part of her realized this was no longer about image. This was real loss. But instead of admitting her fault, she simply remained silent. And when Grace rose, handed Elliot to Linda, and walked toward the staircase with her back straight and her face unreadable, no one stood in her way. No one felt entitled to stop her. Grace's hand freed each small finger clinging to her skirt as if severing each tendon of her own heart. Every tug, every gasp of Elliot felt like invisible hooks anchoring her heart in place, tethering past and present together. The memory of Micah lost and Elliot standing there, crying as though the world were collapsing inside a 4-year-old's chest. "You have to go," Grace whispered, her voice trembling but unbroken. "But you will be okay. You are a strong boy. Always hold on to that in your heart." "I don't want to be strong," Elliot screamed. "I want my mommy. I love you, Mommy." That cry reverberated down the champagne-colored, velvet-carpeted hallway, through walls that had heard untold classical melodies, yet never contained the true anguish of a child's sorrow. Grace turned away. She could not stay any longer. She could not allow herself to weaken another second, because if she did, she knew she would no longer have the strength to leave. Her legs wobbled, but her steps remained sure. No one steadied her. No one escorted her. The winding wooden staircase stood before her like a slow-motion film, each step a memory. Elliot's first unsteady toddles, Elliot tumbling down and crying in fright, Elliot clutching her leg in honey-stained pajamas. Now, all of it was becoming memory, still fresh, yet forever falling behind her. In Grace's hands was a small wooden box, not luggage, not a parting gift, but the one thing she carried away, a crayon drawing Elliot had given her weeks ago. 2 stick figures, one a child and the other a grown-up wearing a triangular dress, hand in hand, standing beneath a crooked, drooping sun. Above them, in shaky but determined scrawl, were the words, "Mommy Grace," as if Elliot feared whoever might try to erase it if he didn't press each letter dark enough. The drawing was carefully folded, its edges slightly crumpled, bearing faint stains of juice and chocolate. To Madison, it might have looked like a grubby scrap of paper, but to Grace, it was living proof of a love that needed no blood ties. Madison stood on the lower landing, neither advancing nor intervening. Her dress remained impeccably pleated, her hair untouched, but her eyes lacked their usual haughtiness. Instead, they held a hollow vacancy, like someone who had won a contest only to watch the prize melt away before her eyes. Elliot struggled in Linda's arms, sobbing in muffled heartbreak. Each time he choked out, "Mommy," Madison flinched, not from pain, but because it shattered her last illusion, that image, money, and control could replace genuine love. She turned to Charles, the husband who had appeared at some point, standing at the top of the stairs like an arbiter of a failed contract. "What will you tell the press?" Madison asked, her voice hoarse from hours of forcing herself together. Charles merely shrugged, his gaze fixed on Grace's retreating form. "There's nothing to say. Social media has already spoken for us." Then he left, leaving Madison alone, and for the first time she felt fear not for scandal's sake, but for losing the power to define herself in her own son's eyes. When Grace reached the upstairs hallway, she entered her small room for the last time. There were no flowers here, no warm, inviting light. But it was real. Here, she had read hundreds of children's books in order to learn how to tell stories to Elliot. Here, she had spent hours cutting colored paper, folding paper airplanes, baking gingerbread at Christmas time for him. Here, she had whispered, "Good night, Micah," every evening when the hallway lights went out. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around one final time. There was nothing to pack, nothing she needed to take, because the most precious thing, Elliot, she had already left behind. Not by choice, but by the force of a world not yet ready to acknowledge a love without a surname. She opened the wooden box and gazed at the drawing once more. Pressing her lips to the words, "Mommy Grace," she closed her eyes. A solitary tear slid down, smudging the crayon lines, yet not blurring them, as if that love had been pressed so deeply into the paper that it could not be erased. Then she refolded the drawing and slipped it into the inner pocket of her uniform, like a talisman. When she stepped out of the room, the door clicked softly behind her. No one had locked it, yet she knew she would never return. Grace descended the stairs. No one met her, no one saw her off. Only the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass panes, casting her shadow across the cold floor like a final, somber refrain. Elliot had been carried up to the bedrooms, his cries still echoing faintly and brokenly. She passed through the living room, past the silent piano no one played, past the dining table where no one asked, "Have you eaten?" Past the priceless paintings on the walls, where not a single photograph captured a genuine family moment. Then she stepped through the front door. She touched the polished bronze doorknob, where her hand had never before left a mark. She did not look back. Behind her was a wound that would never bleed, yet leave a scar for life. For her, for Elliot, and for Madison, though Madison did not yet know it. At least, not yet. A week after Grace left the Whitmore estate, the mansion was dressed up as if nothing had ever happened. Madison went ahead with the annual charity gala, a major event gathering figures from finance, healthcare, and media, as though not a single crack had ever run through the Whitmore brand. White orchids hung across the pergola like silent fireworks. The entry carpet had been replaced, and the garden lighting reprogrammed to be even more precise. The menu was updated: foie gras, caviar, and passion fruit mint cocktails. Madison had prepared all of it in 7 days of growing coldness, saying nothing. No one mentioned Grace. No one asked about Elliot, the suddenly withdrawn child at the center of last week's incident, why he was not in attendance. Madison assumed everything had quieted down, that social media had other fish to fry, that the controversial images from last week had been buried by a higher-profile video, a horrific traffic accident in a neighboring state. But she'd forgotten that some truths don't need noise to persist. They endure like breath, waiting for the exact moment to re-emerge. Guests arrived in droves: CEOs, politicians, publishing magnates, lifestyle influencers. All came through the doors. Madison stood at the entrance, her eyes bright, her practiced smile flawless. Then a stranger appeared at the gate, familiar to the world but unknown to Madison. A black woman, around 35, wearing a crisply tailored white suit, pointed toe leather pumps, standing tall and regal. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her gaze was steady and electric, focused on one direction. This was Dr. Lena Hayes, a renowned pediatrician recently honored by Forbes as one of America's top young innovators in pediatric medicine. She'd been on the under 30 list less than a decade ago, and now she was an unplanned VIP guest at Madison's event. Madison's smile faltered as she approached, sounding off-kilter. "Dr. Hayes, I didn't expect you to come. My assistant said I received an invitation from the Whitmore Foundation," Lena replied softly, her eyes still sweeping the crowd. "I happened to be nearby for a conference, so I thought I'd stop by." Her tone contained no accusation, yet something in her gaze made Madison shiver, as though she were being seen right through, even though Lena hadn't looked directly at her. But that moment did not last long, because as Lena passed the dessert table en route to the main house, she saw someone. At the end of the service hallway, where the side kitchen gaped open under fluorescent lights, the clang of pans, and the aroma of simmering sauce, stood Grace. She wore her pale gray uniform, carrying a glass tray, her head slightly bowed as she hurried toward the buffet line. Lena froze, breath catching in her chest. "Grace?" Her voice cracked like a snapped guitar string. The tray in Grace's hands wobbled, but Grace managed to steady it. Their eyes met, and in that single heartbeat, more than a decade of memory surged back to life. "Grace," Lena whispered, stepping away from the group of guests clustering around. "Is that really you?" Grace blinked. In that instant, her face looked as it had once been, not as the quiet servant, but as the woman who had once taken this stubborn child's hand and said, "You're not slow. You've just never been shown the right way." "Lena?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Hayes began to cry, unable to preserve her composure, unable to choose her words. She threw herself into Grace's arms amid the stunned stillness of everyone around them. You taught me to read," Lena choked out. "When everyone else thought I was just an orphaned runaway, unworthy of help, you believed in me. You said I had value. I am a doctor today, because of you." Madison stood a short distance away, paralyzed as though she'd been cast in ice. No one paid her any more mind. Phones came up, cameras rolling. People stepped back, forming a natural circle around the two women, one holding the other, both teary-eyed. In that moment, Grace was no longer the housekeeper. She was the source of someone's achievement. "I never forgot you, Grace," Lena said, placing both hands on Grace's shoulders. I dreamed of telling the world this day would come. I never expected it to be today, but perhaps it's just in time. A few guests wiped away tears. A server let drop an unfolded napkin next to the dessert table. In the background, a piano began playing. Not the rehearsed piece Madison had selected, but a new melody, one that struck a chord where Madison's speeches had never reached before, deep in the listener's heart. Lena still held Grace's hand, hands once made thin by wielding a mop, guiding a child through spelling lessons, and soothing nightmares with a mother's lullaby despite having no official title. Now those hands were raised as a symbol. She turned to face the watching crowd without fear or hesitation. No longer simply doctor. Lena Hayes, she was the little girl once deemed invisible, who had been lifted up by a love that had never sought the spotlight. Do you see her? Lena's voice rang out, steady but heavy, each syllable pounding the marble floor of the Whitmore estate like a hammer. She is not just a nanny, she is the woman who saved my life, who was the first to tell me I was worthy of a future. Silence filled the room. Neither awkward nor polite, but a collective cultural shock. People who thought they understood class and decorum were now witnessing a seismic shift in their worldview. An older man with silver hair, a prominent banker, set down his glass and muttered to his neighbor, I always assumed Grace was just the help. My God. A TikTok influencer, live streaming, zoomed in on Lena and Grace, captioning, No one knew she changed an entire generation. For Mommy Grace, for our true hero. Within 20 minutes, Mommy Grace was trending in California. Within 45 minutes, posts about them spread nationwide. A black nanny saves the future of a famous doctor. The woman who was fired for being called Mommy. Turns out she's a silent hero. Grace Carter, from housekeeper to community education icon. Madison stood frozen, her wine glass trembling in her hand, knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly. She tried to smile, but her lips were rigid, unresponsive. Her entire life had been layers of masks and meticulously staged events, now shattered by a woman she'd once thought less valuable than a silk tablecloth. At that moment, Charles Whitmore, her husband, appeared at the back of the room. He saw Lena, then Grace, then the murmuring crowd swarming around them. Instantly, he understood what was happening, something Madison, with all her savvy and control, had not anticipated. A female reporter edged closer to Lena, extending a microphone. Dr. Hayes, do you know what Grace is doing right now? Working back there in the kitchen, Lena replied without drama, at the very event where people called her the help, treating her like an object. The camera panned to Madison. A guest whispered, Didn't the Whitmores champion equality in education? Right, someone else answered. They talk equality, but then they toss someone like Grace out the door. Amid her embarrassment, Madison tried to compose herself. She stepped toward Lena and Grace, her smile twisted. We are honored to have Dr. Hayes here today, she said, voice nearly rehearsed. And about Grace, there must be some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Madison, Lena cut in, her tone as sharp as a blade. You knew exactly what you were doing when you fired Grace just because Elliot called her Mommy. And now, the whole world will know. Lena turned to Grace and lifted her hand high. She is the mother of my soul, of Elliot's soul, and of countless children who've never had a voice in this system. We will no longer let someone like her be silenced. Applause began, tentative at first, then swelling like a rainstorm in a drought. People who had once seen Grace as the hallway cleaner now rose to clap. Not because they changed overnight, but because they finally saw her true humanity, long hidden. Madison took a step back. The wine glass in her hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. breaking apart like the last protective shell that could not withstand the weight of truth. As the final round of applause died away, gazes still lingered in the air, not on the hostess of the evening, but on the woman who had just stepped out from life's shadows. Madison stood motionless, as if turned to stone. All attention had shifted away from her gown and the Whitmore brand she had built like an invincible empire. In a corner behind the stage, Charles Whitmore took a sip of white wine, his grip on the glass tighter than usual. He was no fool when it came to media. On the contrary, he understood all too well how quickly public opinion could turn, and how swiftly a name could be tagged as toxic. Madison had become that toxic name, and if they didn't handle this carefully, the Whitmore family's entire reputation could collapse overnight. He set his glass down, straightened his tie, and moved toward his wife, leaning in close so only she could hear. "We need to bring her back, immediately. A positive article, a press conference with her by your side. We can turn this around." Madison forced a smile, though her eyes remained fixed on Grace, now removing her apron as if shedding invisible shackles. She swallowed hard and quickly followed Charles toward the back of the stage, smoothing her gown as she strode over the red tile floor toward where Grace and Lena stood. Charles trailed behind. The event coordinator hurried to slip on her earpiece and whispered to her assistant, "Revise the guest list. Grace Carter is our focal point now. Get every photo of her from tonight's event." Grace stood against the exposed brick wall, the light from the side kitchen casting her face in warm, steady relief. Lena still held her hand gently, as if afraid to let go and risk losing the past all over again. Madison approached, without her usual practiced smile, without a disdainful glare or cutting remark. Instead, she appeared as a woman clutching her last vestige of power, the ability to forgive in order to save face. "Grace," she began, her voice so soft Lena frowned. "Perhaps I overreacted. We could talk things through more, civilized." Grace said nothing. She just looked at her. Madison pressed on. "To be honest, Elliot, the boy needs you, and the media is watching. There's interest in you now. We'd like to offer you a position, different than before. Higher pay, a different title, maybe family care specialist, or emotional development advisor." Lena squeezed Grace's hand, a reminder that you are not a commodity. Charles stepped forward. "To be candid, Miss Carter, the Whitmore Foundation is expanding its philanthropy. If you agree to stay, we can sponsor a community center in your name. Your name will be everywhere in our press. It's a major step." Madison nodded and added, trying to smile, "And of course, you'll have a private office with staff of your own. No more kitchen duties or cleaning. Everything will be different." Grace lowered her head, as if thinking. But when she looked up, her eyes held no hesitation, only a strength honed by years of endurance and loss. "I know you don't need me. You only need me when I stay silent." No one spoke. Grace stepped toward Madison. No threat, no anger, but with undeniable authority. "I cannot remain in a place where my love for a child is considered a flaw in the system." Madison stiffened. "Elliot loves me because I am truly present for him. Not because of a title, not for reputation. And if all you want from me today is to balance the optics, then I'm sorry. But I am not here to play a background role for anyone anymore." Grace took one step back, releasing Lena's hand. Not as a rejection, but to stand on her own. "I used to kneel before people like you." She looked straight at Madison. "But now I stand and I walk away." The room froze. Charles exhaled, disappointed. Madison turned and saw her own gaze falter, as if, for the first time in her life, she no longer controlled her own narrative. For the first time, no one was looking at Madison Whitmore as a perfect symbol. They saw a woman whose mask had been stripped away, leaving nothing to glisten. Grace turned and walked away, Lena matching her stride. No one stopped her. A young server standing to one side nodded quietly. An elderly guest smiled at Grace with admiration. And Elliot, from upstairs, where he'd been watching through a gap in the railing, raised his hand and waved. He said nothing, but that little wave and his smile were the final confirmation that Mommy Grace would never be forgotten again. The massive black iron gates of the Whitmore estate swung open slowly, the hinges creaking eerily, as though the house itself shuddered to witness something it had never seen before. A woman walking away not quietly, but with honor. Grace carried little. Just an old suitcase with worn wheels and a small wooden box held close to her chest. Inside lay Elliot's crayon drawing and the frayed photograph of Micah, her son who had passed away, whom she now believed lived on in part through Elliot. She had just stepped off the front stoop when pounding footsteps came from behind. "Mommy Grace," Elliot's voice pierced her like a knife in the heart. Still in his spaceship print pajamas and barefoot, he raced across the marble courtyard, ignoring Madison's watching gaze and the butler's hollow calls. He flung himself at Grace's legs, sobbing, "I promise I'll be good. I'll study hard. I'll remember you." Grace bent down and hugged Elliot tightly. She did not cry or wail, only exhaled deeply, as if gathering every feeling into this last embrace. "You are the light I've been given back from the darkness," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Live kindly, Elliot, whether anyone sees you or applauds you or not. Be kind, for that's the only way to hold on to your soul." Elliot nodded, tears streaming down like a river. "I love you, Mommy." Grace brushed his hair and kissed his forehead. Then she gently freed his hand from her blouse, as though tearing away a piece of herself, stood, and turned to leave. She did not look back. She could not, because if she did, she knew she would not be able to move forward. The iron gate clanged shut behind her. Beyond those gates, Madison stood silently on the second-floor balcony, looking down with a steely glare. But for the first time, deep inside, she felt something close to fear. She had been unable to keep that woman with her power, nor could she extinguish the image of a true mother in her own son's eyes. Echoing in Madison's mind was Lena's voice. "Grace is not just a babysitter. She is the embodiment of character, of hope, of the most beautiful memory a child can carry for a lifetime." And now, Madison understood. She had lost the one thing that made her own child feel truly loved. Outside, Grace rolled her suitcase slowly down the brick path flanked by cherry trees. Trees Madison had planted only to look good on camera. Petals fluttered with the breeze, drifting onto her shoulders and hair, as if to escort a woman walking away in honor, no fanfare needed. A silver car waited at the path's end. Inside sat Lena, her passenger seat already open, waiting for her like a comrade after a silent battle. Grace said nothing, only nodded. Lena understood. As the car pulled away, Grace kept her gaze forward. Tears fell not in a torrent but one by one, soaking her clothes, seeping into her heart, into her memories. On Lena's phone, a message from an unknown number appeared. "We are representatives of the National Community Development Organization. Your story inspired us. We would like to invite you to Washington to speak." Lena turned and smiled, her eyes shining. "Are you ready for the next chapter?" Grace offered a soft, genuine smile, the first unforced one in years. "I am ready, not to serve, but to build." Back inside the Holleridge estate, Madison quietly entered Elliot's room. The room was silent. On the desk, Elliot had left a short, scrawled note. "I will miss Mommy Grace, but I'm not mad at you. You don't have to call her Mom, but I always will." Madison sat on the bed and closed her eyes in silence. She had won countless big deals, orchestrated political and media networks, but in the smallest battle, becoming the mother her son truly needed, she had lost. Quietly and most bitterly. Just 1 month after leaving the Whitmore estate, Grace Carter did something no one expected. She didn't run away, remain silent, or turn her back on life. She returned to the humble neighborhood where she'd grown up, South Atlanta, where sidewalks still cracked and gates creaked every morning. But amid those cracks, she planted a new seed, Micah's house. The center occupies a single-story, pale yellow house with a red roof and white wooden doors, modest but welcoming. There are no surveillance cameras in every corner like in wealthy homes, no rigid schedules pinned to the walls. Here, children are allowed to be children. Right inside the entrance, a simple wooden sign reads, "Welcome to a place where hearts are heard, not judged." Inside, the walls are painted soft pastels, dotted with children's drawings, crooked rainbows, smiling suns, a three-legged cat. Everything is left untouched, no erasing or refining, because, as Grace says, no pain needs hiding, and no expression needs fixing. The reading room is where the kids gather most often. A knee-high bookshelf overflows with stories. A plush rug covers the floor, and warm golden lamps cast a gentle glow. A boy with crossed eyes once whispered to Grace, "Here I can read without being laughed at." In the art room, walls are hung with paintings. Real art, no grades, no assignments. One immigrant girl who'd lost her mother on their journey drew 2 hands, one large, one small, clasped together over an ocean. Grace quietly taped that drawing to the front door so every child who entered would know, "You are not alone." In the office, only one picture hangs on the wall, framed, Elliot and Mommy Grace. A simple, vibrant sketch. A blonde-haired boy hugging a black woman in a blue dress. Both are smiling. Grace didn't add any titles beneath her name. Not director, not founder. Her nameplate simply reads Grace, because in this place, no title is needed to love. Lena, now serving as Micah's house's medical advisor, walked in one afternoon, clutching a stack of papers. "There's a public school in Alabama that wants to replicate your model," she said, setting the files down. "They've asked for our help training teachers in emotional development. Would you agree?" Grace looked up, gazing out the window where 3 children played in the yard, 2 covered in dirt, one helping a friend who'd fallen. She smiled and replied, "If we can plant a different seed, why wouldn't we?" Meanwhile, in a high-rise back at Holleridge, Madison Whitmore sat at her laptop in her office, eyes fixed on the screen. The headlines still blazed across news sites. From nanny to emotional education icon, Grace Carter and Micah's house are shaking up the system. Both investors and the Whitmore Foundation board began asking, why didn't we invite Grace to partner from the start? Why did we refuse a woman whose name could have put us on the national map? Madison stayed silent. She knew there was no "from the start" anymore. She'd had her chance, and destroyed it through arrogance, prejudice, and the obsession that love must be managed like a business deal. Charles walked in, glancing at the headlines, then said, "She's becoming an icon, and Elliot hasn't mentioned her once since that day." Madison turned away, her hand reflexively touching a family photo frame, where Elliot stands in the center but without a smile. She realized the boy's smile had gone with that woman, and it would never return. That evening, as the sun set behind Micah's house's red roof, a car pulled up on the far side of the street. Elliot sat inside, looking out the window. He neither climbed out nor said a word. He just watched for a very long time. In his hands was a small box. Inside lay the toy robot Grace had once given him. "Mom," Elliot whispered to the driver, "I just want to know, Does Mommy Grace miss me as much as I miss her? The driver smiled. She definitely does, kiddo. Elliot didn't step out, but before the car drove away, he pressed a small note against the gate. Mommy Grace, if you read this, I still remember how you made my evening cocoa, and I still love that you never called me a nuisance. Grace found that note the next day. She didn't cry, but she placed it next to the framed drawing of Elliot and Mommy Grace. Because some things don't need to be shouted, they simply exist, like a thread of red linking two hearts through time, through loss, through discrimination, and they never break. In the late autumn afternoon sunlight, when the sun filtered through the brilliant orange leaves and drifted onto the porch like scattered gold, Grace Carter sat in a wicker chair outside Micah's house, one hand holding an old comic book and the other soothing a little boy whose head rested in her lap. Grace's voice was warm and patient as she repeated lines from a fairy tale about children who find a home after being abandoned. Every word, every pause, wasn't just storytelling, it was healing. In the backyard, a few children were playing build a castle with pillows and blankets. A Latina girl named Lucia, whose mother had been deported, laughed truly as a friend placed a princess crown on her head. Inside the dining room, a Native American boy sat quietly writing a letter to his mother who passed away, using colored pencils. Grace would tuck that letter into the mother memory box, a place where children send their memories instead of burying them. There were no cameras, no live stream, no hashtags, only the silent presence of a woman who had lost one child, and from that fracture, opened a home for hundreds of others. As the afternoon waned, Lena entered, holding a white envelope stamped with the Great Seal. She hesitated for a moment before passing it to Grace. "You've been invited to speak at the National Education Conference next month," Lena said. "For the first time, the government wants to hear from a mother, not because of her title, but because of the many hearts you've saved." Grace was silent. Her finger traced the name printed on the envelope. Then she closed it, set it aside, and looked up. "I will go, not to speak about Grace Carter, but to speak about Micah, about Elliot, and about the children no one ever believed could have a voice." 1 month later, in Washington, D.C., in an auditorium seating thousands, spotlights shone on the podium, seats meant only for secretaries, PhDs, and people with long lists of credentials. Grace stepped up to the lectern wearing a simple linen dress and worn shoes, her heart whole. Without a grand introduction, she placed a picture on the stand, Elliot and Mommy Grace. The entire room fell silent. I am not a trained educator. I am not a psychologist. I was the one making bottles, tying shoelaces, and singing other people's children to sleep. But in every trembling gaze of children who had never known true love, I learned how to be a mother, without giving birth to them. I lost a child to racism, and I nearly lost hope until a child, no blood relation, no shared surname, called me Mommy. And from that call, I was born again. In the front row, some members of Congress bowed their heads. In the back, news cameras captured not just her words, but every tear glinting in the eyes of people quietly weeping. I am not asking for funding. I am not asking for policy changes. I only want you, those who hold power, to remember, children don't need fancy schools. They need someone to kneel down to their level and say, "You are not invisible." The audience erupted into a nearly 2-minute standing ovation. The next day, the Mommy Grace resurfaced, but this time it wasn't rage. It was to spread hope. Social media was flooded with posts like, "I was once a child in foster care. I wish there were a Micah's house near me." I've been a teacher for 15 years. Today, I apologized to a student for scolding him when he wasn't paying attention, unaware that he had just lost his mother. Grace Carter didn't just save Elliot. she saved a system losing its humanity. Back in the Holleridge estate, Madison watched the speech on a big screen, alone in the cold, expansive living room. She saw Grace holding the picture of Elliot, clear and warm, no filter needed. Elliot stood beside her, a bit older now, quietly present. "Do you still remember her?" Madison asked. Elliot nodded, then turned to her and said, "It's not her. It's Mommy Grace." Those few words, light as a breeze, yet powerful enough to shake the world of control, status, and prejudice that Madison had built, hit her like a revelation. She sat in silence, blinking slowly for the first time. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived at Micah's house. No return name, just these lines. "I don't know if it's too late to learn how to be a real mother, but if it is possible, thank you for showing the way to the light." Grace did not write back. Instead, she pinned that note next to Elliot's newest card, a drawing of 3 hearts, one large, one medium, one small. At the bottom, he had written in careful block letters, "Mommy Grace is the heartbeat of all 3 of these hearts." This story didn't end with fireworks or titles. It ended with unbidden embraces, kindness mending broken pieces, and one question left hanging. In this life, do we choose to be a mother of titles or a mother of souls? In a world where labels often come before hearts, Grace Carter's story reminds us that true love needs no surname or applause, only someone present and brave enough to embrace those the world has forgotten. She didn't need papers to be a mother. She was a mother, in the deepest, most enduring, and beautiful way. What about you? Have you ever met someone like Mommy Grace, a person who needs no title, yet quietly lifts your life? Share that story with us in the comments below. And please like this video, share it with anyone who needs a bit of light on a dark day, and subscribe so you don't miss more heart-changing stories like this. Because sometimes, just one person believing in us is enough to change the whole world.